Hi, everyone. My name is Brian, and I'm the co-founder and co-organizer of the New York Supply Chain Meetup. Hold on, I think I need to put myself on this. Oh, well, let's just go ahead. So I'm the co-founder and co-organizer of the New York Supply Chain Meetup. I'm excited today to introduce you to our guest, Azeem Azhar, who I've been connected to since May 2016. I looked it up. I looked it up, and I can't remember what the pretext for us connecting was. I think I probably sent you a note and said something like, I think you're going to do something interesting in the future. And it's my job to connect with people I think we'll do interesting things in the future. Will you connect? And you kindly said yes. So welcome to the New York Supply Chain Meetup, the flagship chapter of the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation. We started this community in November 2017. And the pretext for the community was to create an environment where people who want to buy new technologies for supply chains can interact in a very low risk, low friction way with the people who are building these new technologies. Since then, we've grown to, could everyone mute their mic if you're not speaking, please? Since then, we've grown to about 3,000 members in the, no, I think I'm getting the numbers wrong. About half the membership in the New York chapter, about 4,000 members in the Federation worldwide, and about 8,000 members in our community on Clubhouse. And of course, on LinkedIn, many more. And so when you published your book, given the topic of exponential technologies, I figured we should try to get you, to talk about the intersection of exponential technologies and supply chains, which I think is relevant both for the technologists and the corporate executives in the community. So welcome. I think.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I think the protocol we should stick to is that we open it up to members of the community to ask questions. So I'll obviously get things started. We'll start the conversation, and if people have questions, they can turn on their mics and ask, or put something in the chat, and I'll monitor it and bring them up on stage. So having said all that, welcome again. And I figured the way we can kick things off is to ask you, well, The Economist has described you as a journalist, a tech executive, a tech investor, an entrepreneur, an innovation executive, and so on and so forth. And so I thought we could start with a question about why your perspective is what it is. And what, in your opinion, is the benefit of having someone like you talk about exponential technologies and their relationship to supply chains?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Brian. And thank you to everybody who's making time today. And I hope we're going to have a great discussion. Should just say, on the subject of globalization, the book is called Exponential in the UK and India and a bunch of other places, but in the United States of America, oh, it's not going to show up. Try and get this right. It's called the Exponential Age. Anyway, the Exponential Age. And
the technology is not quite there yet.
The technology, yeah. Nor is sort of global publishing rights. And I think what's interesting perhaps about the way that I tell this story, and what I've tried to do with the book is, I've tried to explain the system that I think is emerging as a result of new general purpose technologies, the relationship between the technologies and the economic and political and social institutions that live around them and shape them and are shaped by them. And I think the reason why it takes somebody with my background to slightly tell that story at this point is that we have to somehow integrate the thinking of economics and political economy and institutions with the understanding of the technology. And there's an old phrase that says, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Or as a friend of mine once said to me, a dog always returns to its own vomit. But let's use the apple and the tree. It's a much nicer phrase.
It's lunchtime in the United States.
I'm so sorry about that. I'm not eating for another couple of hours. But I was born in 1972, and it's the year after the Intel 4004 processor was launched, and it was just before the personal computing wave started to take off. And in fact, I first saw a kit personal computer in 1979 in Zambia, where I lived in sub-Saharan Africa. No global supply chains really at that point. I have no idea how it got to my next door neighbor's house, but it did. And so the history of my growing up was around kind of space opera and technology and computers in the home. I still have my first computer from 1981. And I grew up alongside coding in assembler and then sort of higher levels of code, and then getting involved in the internet starting in the early 90s. But the other thing that was happening to me was that, why was I in Zambia in the first place? Well, my parents were in Zambia. My parents were in Zambia because they were setting up economic institutions in a newly independent country. Zambia had been independent for 6 years. And my dad was an economist who worried about rural institutions, and so was working on those institutional questions. So the family background was connected to this idea of institutions and the political economy. And so that gives me one foot in each camp. And at moments in my history, I had an opportunity to dabble in one than in the other. So I did sort of politics and economics at university, but I was also coding, and the only person doing that course to do a coding course in the 90s. And then I joined The Guardian, but I ended up writing the first content management system for The Guardian, as well as being a journalist back in 1994. And so what my career has done is it's allowed me to understand these institutional questions, spend time as a regulator as well. But fundamentally, I spend virtually all of my time with technology, with founders, investing in their companies and building companies and succeeding and not succeeding. And I think it's that integration, that the sense that I've been at the front line of it, the sense that I have watched my engineers use Moore's law to their advantage, and the fact that I've also got something of a academic background and have worked in those areas, allows me to tell the story in a way that I think that's different to when you get a really, really deep, scientifically strong technologist like a Ray Kurzweil tell the story, or a business school professor tell the story.
That's excellent. And it's interesting because when I think about why I'm so fascinated by supply chains, I think my growing up in northern Ghana and northern Nigeria, and then living in the United States and going to college in the United States and seeing the difference in how supply chains in the two environments function is one driving factor. So I thought, rather than ask you direct questions about chapters in the book or topics in the book, I did some reading and collected some statements, and I thought I'd raise the statements and let you reflect on how that statement is supported or not supported by your work on the book. And again, if you're in the audience and you have a question, just raise your hand or post it in the chat box, and I'll discuss it with Azeem. So the very first one is this statement by Venkatesh Rao, who published an essay called "Remystifying Supply Chains." And he says, I thought this was interesting. He said, supply chains as they exist today are as young and mysterious as the internet. The ongoing supply chain crisis is at least as novel an event in human history as the recent big Facebook outage, arguably more novel. that took me by surprise. I was like, that's something Brian is supposed to say as he tries to engage in propaganda about supply chains. Why is someone else saying this? But what do you think?
I mean, it's true that the supply chains are impressive and intricate and complex. I always think about the MIT beer game simulator, which is at least 20 years old and shows the way that information can flow back and up and down and get confused and clog up even a simple supply chain with not too many participants. The global supply chain has got to where it's got to, and enabled what I call the exponential age. Then the two have fed into each other. The availability of IT systems and databases that allow us to track where things are, the ability to then go into ports and turn those containers into physical packets of goods rather than digital packets of data, and being able to put in the kind of optimizations that only automation can afford. The driver, of course, the ships have got much bigger. 200,000 containers on the biggest ships rather than 600. But it's not about the scale of the ships that's made a difference. It's actually been about the sort of the numbers and our ability to use IT to track what's going on. So while we move hundreds of thousands of deadweight tonnage around the world every hour, what's underlying that is computing and databases and making that problem in some sense tractable. And then the complexity that emerges from it is also an issue of design. The Facebook outage was a design-based outage. They started to centralize lots of components of Facebook in a single place. A large part of what I think we're seeing in the supply chain shock today, and bear in mind there have been so many shocks, right? Let's not forget there is literally the COVID shock that echoed across at different times. But is also to do with business design. I just spent a couple of hours talking to the number two at Ford, and he made the point that, well, look, we just got into the habit of having no inventories, right? We had no buffer if anything went wrong. It was all existed in a ledger, and we knew it was going to arrive at a certain point, and we're going to learn from that. So those are design things that you can start to do. And I think actually in the growth of the internet, you saw similar things happening, right? You saw the internet being fragile, and it's much less fragile now in some areas because there's more resilience that's built into the system. So I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea point that we've got to.
Yeah. Thank you. And on that note, for people who haven't read the book yet, what are exponential technologies and what is the exponential age? How are they connected to one another?
Yeah, I think that's a really important central concept in the book. Let's just step back a little bit. Our kind of industrial, economic, political configurations are closely related to the technologies at the time. They shape and feed each other. And so if you think about the world in 1880, America or the United Kingdom in 1880 or 1890, it still ran on steam, large numbers of farms, expensive telegraphs being sent back and forth. And starting in the 1890s, the general purpose technologies of the car and the telephone and electricity started to emerge. And out of those technologies, in a 30-year period, we transformed the world to something that looks much more modern. And also in terms of things like the worker bargain and mass production and suburbs and weekends and so on. So technologies have these second and third order impacts, helping shape the political and economic settlement. Where we sit today, at the start of the 21st century, is four major technology domains. Our general purpose technologies of computing, which we know a lot about, of what's happening with energy and renewable storage, 3D printing, which is very, very emergent and nascent. And then the fourth area is the realm of biology, the intersection of protein engineering and genome writing with machine learning and engineering approaches. And each of those domains have got broad applicability across our economy, the way that the car did or the telephone did. But they are improving on a price performance basis at this exponential rate. So if they weren't improving on a price performance basis at an exponential rate, we would expect them to have significant impacts in the ways that we organize our industries, economies, and businesses and communities. But they are improving at, in the case of computing, 44% per annum on a price performance basis, compounded for 60 years. In the case of cell programming, it's faster than that. In the case of renewable power, it's getting 20% cheaper every year and has been for 2 decades. Wow. And so those are exponential patterns. They follow that curve that's roughly sketched on the cover of the book. Mm-hmm. They get much, much more cheap, much more quickly, and therefore they get used more excessively within the economy. And that gives rise to complementary businesses that rewrites industrial configurations. So that's a sort of the shock to the system that is happening quite quickly. Mm-hmm. And for me, the exponential age is the moment where those drivers become the drivers of global economics and geopolitics. So 15, 20 years ago, the drivers of global politics were basically oil. I was like, can we get the oil? And can we get it into the cars in Texas? And then off comes shale and natural gas and fracking, and America gets energy independence. And suddenly the Nimitz is not in the Straits of Hormuz 6 months a year. And yet by about 2011, 2010, the world's biggest companies were still ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, General Motors, General Electric, AT&T, all founded in the 1890s to 1910. Yeah. By 2013, ExxonMobil leaves the top 10. By 2015, the top 10 companies are these weird networked digital companies, plus Tesla, plus Saudi Aramco, which sort of hangs in there. And that is the exponential age, the thing that is driving the way that we think about the big questions in economics and politics are now not based on the general purpose technologies of the 20th century, but these 4 platforms that are emerging and changing very quickly now.
That's interesting. And so for, and I know I'm jumping away from the statements I wanted us to go through, but for someone that is an executive in a company that is basically, let's call them legacy industries, for companies in legacy industries where technology is not really the core of their business, what would you say those executives should be? How should they approach this new age that we're going into? And I'm focusing on the executives because my way of thinking about it is that the technologists and entrepreneurs in our community will keep building on these new platforms, right?
Yeah.
It's the people who are tasked with managing these legacy companies, these incumbent companies in legacy industries, who have to worry about, well, what does this new age mean for how I think about my business and my company's prospects?
Yeah. Well, every industry is different and every company is different. So it's, the prescription looks really, really distinctly different for a car company or an oil company to what it looks like as a newspaper business, such as there are any remaining. Yeah. But I think there are some things that one can, beliefs and that you can take and tools you can take. The first is you have to some extent, abandon your skepticism about these kind of technologies and what they will do, and get your head around what's happening and how well they work and where they don't work. I remember talking to a reasonably senior exec in a corporate venturing group at one of the oil companies who only 3 years ago, who launched a savage attack on how bad electric vehicles were. And I asked this person about what their experience with them was, and they had never actually driven a Tesla.
Yeah.
Right. They hadn't done it. They had bought the mantra. And I think that you need to avoid those sort of assumptions. I mean, even today, I hear people saying, well, yeah, the thing is that renewable power generation of electricity is more expensive than setting up a new coal plant. And that's just manifestly not true.
It's not true. Right?
It's just not true. But why do you persist in that belief? So I think one of the starting points is to get to grips with what's really going on, and that some of that comes out in the book, and the way in which that I'm able to talk about why the prices decline and what you should expect about those declines. And then I think you have to get into a what if game, right? So what if this was true? What would it
Yes.
actually mean? And I have a story in the book about 15 years ago, I invested in a company that would now be called an AI company. It was a spin out of Xerox PARC.
Mm-hmm.
And in the financial model, the founder had kind of got this increasing amount of computing he was going to need, but the
Mm-hmm.
cost was staying fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, how come your compute needs are going to get so high? Why is the cost not going up so fast? And he just said three words to me, one of which I'm not sure is a word. Um, de Moore's law. And effectively, this kind of brilliant Silicon Valley NASA rocket scientist had said, look, yes, we're going to need tons of compute, but I can basically predict, but depend on compute cycles getting 44% cheaper every year for the next
Yeah.
5-10 years
Yeah.
as we look out in this plan. So you have to start, I think, to think about things like this. And in the conversation I had with the number two at Ford, Hao Tai Tang, I asked him, why did it take Ford so long to really move towards electric vehicles and decide that that was going to be the powertrain of the future?
Mm-hmm.
And they'd experimented for years with electrics and
Yeah.
hydrogen fuel cells and so on. And he essentially said, look, it's Tesla, right? Tesla proved it could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of the challenge in legacy businesses, and is any number of business school professors have written about this, is that the level of evidence that you are expected to provide to yourself, let alone to your peers, is just really high, and you're not rewarded for taking a sort of risk-adjusted punt. Now, what's happened in the last few years is they've got much better at figuring out how to take those risks and how to experiment, but it's far from complete.
Your statement about the amount of evidence you need for yourself and your peers really rings home, because I've been talking about, hey, supply chain is going to be where the action is from the perspective of early stage technology investing, at least since 2016, maybe even 2015. But the evidence just did not exist that I knew what I was doing or what I was talking about. And then the pandemic hits, and the joke I like to crack now is the president of the United States is on TV talking to people about how he's going to fix supply chain problems so they can get their Christmas gifts. That's how important it's become. Well, MJ is asking a question in the chat, and he says, or it's a she. I don't know if MJ is a he or a she, but MJ
it's
says,
Manish, Brian. It's Manish.
Oh, hi, Manish.
I just put my initials.
Yeah. Hi, Manish.
Yeah.
Go
Hi,
ahead
Azeem.
and ask the question. Go ahead and ask the question.
Hi. So, Azeem and Brian, actually, for everyone. So my question is about the fact that right now in the headlines, we hear so much about the Port of Los Angeles and container ships being backed up. We hear about things like in China, the power issues have meant that they've shut down some days of magnesium production, which is going to impact car manufacturers who need aluminium and magnesium. So, but in the future, I'm already seeing that, for example, in medicine, there are people starting to develop software apps that you can download instead of taking a physical tablet, which means maybe for certain diseases in the future, instead of a physical tablet and ingredients moved around the world and needing a big supply chain of factories and manufacturing and logistics, that won't necessarily be needed because people are downloading an app for a treatment. Or in the case of products and services, given net zero and trying to decarbonize entire parts of the economy, about actually 3D printing something closer to your home instead of shipping it from another country, or even when it comes to sustainable agriculture, as in 3D printing coffee beans, or not 3D printing, but growing coffee beans or meat substitutes in a lab locally, rather than actually getting meat shipped from halfway across the world, right? Or food and vegetables. So basically my question is, do you envisage, as I've based upon what I've said, and do you also share the opinion that we will probably need fewer container ships, fewer factories, fewer supply chain professionals and the entire industry, because if you look at how things are changing and all the drivers have changed, we can't just have all these ships running around the world delivering things because we want something just in time from Amazon here in the UK or the US.
I mean, the global economy is this huge thing, and it's got a lot of momentum behind it, and supply chains are they're the lifeblood of it, and so turning that off is going to be a big ask. But you're right, the technologies that you've described create headwinds for the sort of unalloyed growth, and so just think about renewable power and what that would entail. Or you think about long-term energy storage using hydrogen. Once you've got a photovoltaic grid running, it's got a 30-year lifetime. You then just need some electrolyzers to create your hydrogen, and you then have long-duration storage, and you can, from that long-duration storage, go off and clean with impunity, create your aluminium with the sort of the relevant electro process. And so you start to see what I would call headwinds as opposed to trade winds against the path the supply chains otherwise might have taken. You also have, I think, two other dimensions that are worth thinking about. The second is that we do want to use less and less materials. And so you're already starting to see a decrease in the material intensity for even for the sort of physical clunky things. So when you think about electric vehicle batteries, the amount of cobalt, which is particularly difficult to source ethically, that Tesla puts in its batteries has dropped by a factor of 6, even as the batteries have got bigger and better over the last several years, because they've got better on the sort of chemistry. And we're obviously looking to increase energy densities in these batteries over time, so they are less resource intensive. And I think the move within ESG to bring in global carbon pricing and force people to account for their raw materials creates a greater desire for efficiency. But of course, that efficiency doesn't turn into absolute reductions, because the demand may grow still faster. But I think the third area that constructs headwinds to the traditional thinking of supply chains, this is not to say, by the way, Brian, that you are out of a job. You still have a job for many, many more years to come. It is just that the sort of the traditional kind of hub and spoke, get it all done in one place and ship it somewhere else. Or, I mean, I know it's more nuanced than that, but it is that the strategic importance, which started with the strategic importance of the technologies, the core chips, and then turned into national security, then turned into economic security, is now out into the politicians' mindset. So what Foxconn did in India 3 years ago to build the first Foxconn factory, to build Indian iPhones in India for Indians, is now becoming much, much more the norm. Whether it is TSMC building chip fabs in America, first ones for 20 years, or in Europe, that is coming as a core demand of big economies to say, we're going to need some resilience, and that resilience is going to have to come not purely from having inventories, but actually from having the manufacturing capacity, even if it is run by TSMC, in Germany, because we'll need that, and we'll need that line of sight. And by the way, it's also convenient that our court orders and warrants can be applied very easily if these factories are in our territorial boundaries.
That ties, Manish, is there something you wanted to follow up on related to the question?
Well, it was. So thank you, Azeem, for answering that, and that's very interesting to hear where you think things are heading. So it's only because when I speak to supply chain professionals, just like when I speak to physicians and nurses, they assume it's business as usual. Budgets are going to get bigger. We're going to need more work done. We're going to have more things happening. Hospitals are going to get bigger, just like people assume factories are going to get bigger and bigger. So that was really just like, I guess the follow-up question, Azeem, for you is how, at what point will the supply chain industry get a wake-up call that things aren't necessarily 100% secure for them as an industry, and that they will have to adapt and change to how the world needs them to over the next 30 or 40 years?
I mean, I don't know what goes on in their heads per se, but I think the messages are getting across. I mean, the purpose of a book like mine is that it's a systemic overview of a lot of different things that I try to tell a coherent story around. But when I talk to the specialists who are on the front line, and perhaps I'm talking to the wrong ones, none of them are saying we've got to widen the Panama Canal because we need bigger ships. They're actually saying there's a push and the pull around labor costs and the quality of automation, and we realize now that the process was crossing too many borders and we have to figure out how to manage that. But they also still recognize, especially with manufacturing and even with the beauty of 3D printing, whenever it shows up, there are still virtues in being very, very large, because there are still virtues in scale and flow and so on. So I think, just to echo what Rich Richardson says in the chat, if they haven't got that message by now, they may never. But I think what you're going to start to see, and certainly when I talk to increasingly both to politicians and to people in larger companies, very few people are saying we're just going to make the lasers here and we're not going to allow anyone to make them anywhere else. They are assuming that they're going to have to go more distributed and have a supply chain that reflects that.
I just want to point out, Manish is in London. He's joining us from London. So one of the statements I thought we could talk about, and perhaps this is, given the conversation that has just transpired, this is a good time to. So the statement is, companies will readily and quickly self-organize to collaborate with one another to accomplish a systemic decarbonization of supply chains in various industries across national boundaries. Wishful thinking, or something that is based somewhat in reality? And this is where you'll have to call on your politics and economics, on the politics and economics that you studied.
So we're already at the point where the capital markets are very, very alert to sustainability and carbon in the investments that they make. And in my podcast in a week's time, next Wednesday, there's a really interesting discussion about this. But essentially, the cost of capital, if you want to build a coal-fired power station, are around 15% higher than if you want to build a wind-based electricity generating plant. So you really are being asked to pay through the roof to make this thing profitable, and on top of that, you're going to look at a 10-year lifespan sort of to make your money back. So the capital markets are really, really keen to, and they have an implicit price of carbon as a consequence that's been baked in there. And the way that you end up seeing this play out, I think, is initially from capital markets, and secondarily from companies with global supply chains, where essentially, if you sign up to be a supplier to any really large company now, you have to make a sustainability declaration. And if you are working with IKEA or with Microsoft, who have said they want to be at a net zero in 9 years' time and climate positive, in other words, have contributed more to the Earth's biodiversity, water resources, and so on by 2050, they are only going to get there if the supply chain does it. And so they will exert their pressure across that supply chain, and there will be a de facto CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, that will emerge perhaps only within IKEA's supply chain, but that's important starting point. And that gets us to the third point, which is that that the CBAMs will start to emerge, and they'll start to become important, and they will be part of the regulation of trade over the coming years. Whether we actually get anything significant out of COP26 in the next couple of weeks is a different question.
Yeah.
But the idea of border adjustment mechanisms is going to become increasingly more important. And I think that's how that kind of cost gets baked into the supply chain thinking.
Got it. Chris says, there are laws announced recently in Europe and in the writing and laws in the writing process at the SEC in the US on global GHG accounting of greenhouse gases. Okay, since we're talking about laws and regulations, I'd like your thoughts on this statement. And I'm using Texas as an example, but I think that there are examples in the UK, probably Brexit as well. And the statement is that the loss of power in Texas is an example of what can happen when people in elected office do not fully understand the complexities and interdependencies of modern supply chains. And I want to take it a step further, because I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about the exponential gap. But it's not understanding the full complexities and interdependencies of supply chains, both within and across national borders, but then also what happens when people in elected office don't understand the implications of the exponential technologies that we're experiencing now.
Well, I'm not an expert on the Texas
that's why we want
energy
to hear,
market.
That's why we want to hear from you, because your opinion is going to be more interesting than the opinion of the experts.
And the thing that strikes me about markets is that it's often about have you got a fragile or an anti-fragile setup, right? Do you have the kind of buffers that are required to deal with shocks? And one of the things that struck me about Texas, which is that you've got this market that has been really, really aggressively deregulated and sort of independent of the 4 major power purchasing areas in the US. So it is a sort of in of itself kind of weird place without that much resilience. And in the UK, we find ourselves in the same place. So whereas in Europe, the strategic gas supplies, natural gas supplies, run to about 20% of annual consumption, so about 60 days. In the UK, we have a gas buffer of 6 days, which is, you're running your brakes much hotter than you would in other sort of safe circumstances. And so part of the question is just about thinking about what happens during these moments of really, really rapid change. And in moments of rapid and uncertain change, you want to have 2 things. You want to have flexibility. You want to be able to get out of the way of a problem, and you need to have resilience, because you're going to go over into some turbulence or over some rough terrain. And I think those are key values that are really important in the exponential age. And the gap that you referred to, Brian, is the point that the technologies create new potentials for good or for ill. And the way we manage those potentials for good or for ill is all about the institutions, which adapt much, much more slowly. And so if you take horse-drawn carriage thinking and try to apply it to the German Autobahn, where cars run at 140 miles an hour, it's going to be a mess. And likewise, if you look at these very rapidly changing technologies and you don't understand what the implications are, and you take an old modality, which could simply just be efficiency above everything else, you won't create the right mechanisms to manage any uncertainty. And the part of the device of the book more broadly is to use that idea of the exponential gap across very, very many different domains of the economy.
So I know we're coming up on 1:15, which is when we said we'd go up till. If anyone has a question they want to ask, put it in the chat or turn on your mic and go ahead and ask. But the last question I wanted you to touch on, Azeem, and I should have written it down. I don't remember the name of the law, but in the book you talk about Moore's law. And yes, Moore's law is really important in how we understand how technology has evolved, especially the technologies that depend on computation. But then you talk about the other law that has evolved in tandem with Moore's law, and how that is a much better rubric for understanding the age that we're going into now. I'd like you to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So Moore's law, for people to just sort of get a refresh, is this idea that computer chips get faster every couple of years, and the reason they get faster is because we can miniaturize the components, the transistors, from micrometers 50 years ago to a few nanometers today, and we get more on the same silicon die. It's roughly the same price, roughly. So the computer prices come down dramatically, and it works out essentially at a doubling of the number of transistors on a chip every couple of years, about a 44% price performance improvement every year, compounded for decade after decade. Now, Moore's law is what I call a social fact, or what an academic called, his first name is Cyrus, and I can't remember his surname for the life of me, unfortunately. I'm going to say Modi, wrote a beautiful book on this, and he says Moore's law is as a social fact. They identified the relationship, and then they used it as the sort of metronome that drove the industry for the next 50 years. But Moore's law is not predictive, because of course, if for 2 years all the semiconductor engineers went on strike, the chips wouldn't get better. So how's that happening? There's a slightly more general relationship which had been identified in 1936, which is just the learning curve. The fact that engineers, when they're building an engineered product, the first time they build it, they don't do it very well. With every doubling of cumulative production, they figure out how to make it better. They figure out how to do it more cheaply, ultimately, because that's what they're optimizing for. And it's a relationship that means that independent of the scale effects, independent of the fact that when I'm making 128 times more of widget X than before, I get my inputs more cheaply. It's that the experience that I've built up allows me to do a better job. And so Wright's law is a really, really great predictor of many, many engineered products. And typically you see an improvement of between 15 and 20% for every doubling of production. Now, that's not dependent on time. That's dependent on the doubling of production. And this is where supply chains come in, because if supply chains allow us to get products out to more people more quickly, you get down Wright's law faster, because cumulative production doubles more quickly. And so the annual improvement in costs is felt much, much more vibrantly. And Wright's law turns out to be a better predictor for what happened with silicon chips than Moore's law. Wright's law is a really good predictor to what's happening with genome sequencing, within protein re-engineering, within satellite launch costs, within satellite bandwidth in space, lithium-ion batteries, the price of electricity generated by wind turbines, the price of photovoltaic cells. And it is the heart of the exponential age, this idea that we can continue to learn, and through that learning, and that often sharing that learning, we become more efficient on a kind of price basis in producing the things that we produce.
That's awesome. Thank you. So on that note, I think we can call things to a close, except of course, I wouldn't be me if I didn't ask one last question. And so the final question I'll ask, and thank you again for the time that you've spent with us, is what question did you expect me to ask that I did not ask?
Brian, that is such a meta question. I'm going to tell it back to you. That was the question I expect you to. No, but you did ask it. I think the question that I would have possibly expected more of was the one that we explored with Manish, which was, what does this actually mean for the structure of the supply chain and the nature of global trade? I think that's a really interesting one because it's not the end of the supply chain professional at all. It's essentially saying the current supply chain looks a lot like the old telephone network, and we're going to end up moving to a supply chain that looks a lot more like the internet, much more distributed, decentralized, localized, routing based, and that's a really exciting place to be.
So perhaps that's a reason to have you on some other time to delve deeper into this question.
I'm always happy to.
Thank you very much. For folks in the audience, there's a link to the book at the very top of the chat box if you haven't read it yet. And please check out Azeem's podcast. It's available wherever you consume your podcasts. I've been a subscriber to his newsletter, Exponential View, which comes out, I think it's every Sunday morning, right? It's every Sunday,
and there's sometimes bonuses on Wednesdays, and for members there's a Wednesday and a Friday mail out as well.
I typically start my Sunday mornings with a cup of coffee and
oh, glad to hear that.
Yeah. So on that note, thank you, Azeem, and to everyone else, thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.